The name brand of the product in your kit is called Extrude. To fabricate a putty reduction guide, 1 unit of base is combined with 1 unit of catalyst via manual manipulation. When the mixture is homogeneous, then it is compressed into a ball or ovoid shape. The putty is then placed over the unprepared tooth, in this exercise, number 14. The mixed putty should extend to cover 1 to 2 teeth beyond the tooth of interest, both mesially and distally. Thus, in this instance, the putty extends over number 13 and number 15, and slightly over number 12 and number 16. Clinically, this will be done on diagnostic casts before an appointment. In a preclinical setting, it may be performed on your typodonts. Once properly positioned, the operator will gently tap the putty down onto the occlusal anatomy of the tooth such that it begins to adapt to the cuspal contours. As the putty extends onto the axial surface, it is important not to pull on the material excessively, as this could distort the impression. Instead, allow the material to form a natural drape over the sides of the teeth and continue tapping the material in towards the contours of each tooth. The putty should extend just past the gingival margins of each tooth, but does not need to cover extensive portions of gingival tissue. As you disperse the putty, be certain that it does not become too thin. The final reduction guide should be 4 to 5 millimeters thick. Thin guides will not act as adequate references. Once the putty is spread to cover the desired dentition, allow it to finish setting. This should take approximately 3 minutes. Resist the temptation to cut the setting time short. Use this time to set up your handpieces, get a new 25 blade, or change the water in your unit. When fully set, the putty should be resilient. It will give slightly to pressure, but will return to its original shape. Firm pressure from a fingernail will leave a small indentation that returns quickly to the original form. At this point, the putty can be removed and inspected. The internal surface of the stent should adapt closely to the occlusal anatomy of each tooth. Specifically, it should be closely adapted to all cusps and fossas without voids. If found to be adequate, the reduction guide can then be trimmed. On the outer edges of the stent, make crisp coronal cuts halfway through the distal-most and mesial-most teeth. You may discard the trimmed edges. Soft tissue is not an accurate reference, and thus putty covering these areas will not be useful and may, in fact, impede full seating of the stent. Cut the putty back approximately 1 millimeter beyond the gingival margin. You may also bevel away excess bulk for patient comfort and ease of insertion. Finally, locate the tooth that will be prepped, number 14, and make a coronal cut exactly halfway through the entire tooth. The reduction guide will now be in 2 pieces. Confirm proper fit of the reduction guide by seating it on the Typodont 1/2 at a time. The cross-section created by the cuts on the outer edges help to confirm that the guide is fully seated. If the stent is not all the way down, it will not serve as an accurate reference. Extending the guide 1 to 1.5 teeth away from the prepared tooth provides a hard stop for the guide and a definite seating position. Once again, this enables the stent to work as an accurate reference. As number 14 is prepared, the guide will no longer be supported by this tooth, thus it relies on proximal surfaces for stable seating. If the guide was cut short or left to balance on tissue alone, it would not be an accurate reference as the guide would be prone to shifting or rocking. You can see from this cross-sectional image how the Putty reduction guide helps to provide assessment of the Buccal, Lingual, and Occlusal reduction, as well as functional cusp and second plane reductions. It provides information regarding depth of reduction as well as buccal and lingual taper. In the preclinic setting, a single reduction guide can be utilized for multiple preparations of the same tooth as long as the proximal teeth are not changed out. Long axis. All of the cuts and reductions on the preparation are made to a point of reference. In fixed prosthodontics, this reference point is almost always the long axis of the tooth. Being able to properly identify this feature is vital for proper amount and orientation of reduction. According to the Glossary of Prosthodontic Terms, the long axis is a theoretical line passing lengthwise through the center of a body. In terms of teeth, the long axis is a theoretical line down the direct middle of the tooth. When preparing teeth for fixed prosthodontics, it is essential that burrs be oriented parallel to this long axis. Deviations from such will result either in over-taper or undercuts of the axial walls. It may also cause over or under reductions. Before prepping, take time to visualize and feel confident about the locale of the long axis on the particular tooth you are working on. Drawing a pencil line can help. Carrying this line over to an adjacent tooth can also serve as a good reference if you lose your orientation while prepping. Depth cuts. The amount of tooth structure removed is dependent upon the type of material that the final restoration will be made out of. When preparing teeth, it is often useful to make a few initial cuts in strategic locations. These cuts are of depths that are generally just shy of the final amount of reduction required. In this way, the operator has a sense of how much reduction is necessary, the coarseness of the burr required, and how much pressure to apply to the burr in order to obtain the desired reduction. It's important to realize that depth cuts generally do not mean sinking the entire depth of the burr into the tooth. It is restricted to simply a portion. Number 14, preparation. Prior to prepping a tooth, confirm that you have a sufficient reduction guide. In a clinical setting, you will also confirm that you have made a sufficient provisional stent. Note the location of the cuts on this guide. You should see ample extension made to adjacent teeth for support and ends that have been trimmed to a crisp finish, as well as confirmation of complete seating of the guide. Now, take a few moments to identify the long axis of number 14. Draw this line with a pencil and have your instructor confirm. In the early stages of your learning, it can be useful to carry this line over to adjacent teeth by drawing parallel pencil lines. These will then become useful points of reference should you ever feel disoriented during your preparation. Prepare to make your depth cuts. Proper axial reduction for a full coverage ceramic restoration is 1.5 millimeters with a 1 millimeter margin and a 2 millimeter occlusal reduction. The ceramic preparation requires a 1 millimeter radial shoulder. To form this, you will use a 6/856 burr. The width of this burr is 1 millimeter. Therefore, sinking this burr 1/2 to 2/3 of its total width will create a depth cut that is approximately 0.5 to 0.7 millimeters deep. Recall that you do not want to make your depth cuts to full depth. Allow room for refinement at the end. Similarly, the axial depth cuts will not be made at the level of the prescribed finish line. Leave room to smooth and fine-tune this margin. As such, the axial depth cuts should extend 1 millimeter above the gingival margins. There will be a total of 6 axial depth cuts on number 14. The first will be in the buccal groove. As you form this, remember to align your burr with the long axis of the tooth. Not tipped inwards towards the cervical constriction, not tipped outwards along the cuspal inclination. Just straight up and down, like so. Make 2 similar cuts on the mesial and distal of the buccal surface of the tooth. Place these depth cuts as close to the mesial and distal line angles of the tooth as possible. Later, they will become part of your break contact procedure. Carry out a similar process on the lingual. Now, place depth cuts on the occlusal surface. Recall that the total occlusal reduction will be 2 millimeters. Holding the burr at the same inclination as the cuspal slope, sink the burr to depth at the height of each cusp. You also make a depth cut down the central groove of the tooth at a depth of 1 to 1.5 millimeters, almost as though you are cutting a Class 1 preparation. You may even use a 330 burr for this if you'd like. As a novice, it can be helpful to color in these depths with a pencil to help you gauge how much you have reduced. It is up to the operator whether occlusal or axial reductions should be done first. This tutorial will feature an axial reduction method. Starting on the buccal, connect your depth cuts. As you connect them and begin to form your margin, you can slowly lower it towards the intended finish line area of 0.5 millimeters above the gingiva. As you connect the depth cuts, be certain to keep track of your burr orientation. Be certain you are in line with the long axis of the tooth. When the margin reaches 1 millimeter in width, the majority of the axial reduction is completed. Turn the Typodont and reorient to gain direct vision and carry out the same procedure on the Lingual. Notice that the operator is using two hands to stabilize the handpiece. The dominant hand is holding a finger rest, while the non-dominant hand supports the top of the handpiece. This can be very useful, especially when forming margins. Now it is time to connect the margins on the mesial and distal surfaces. This is done via the process of breaking contact. Realize that the teeth have cervical constrictions in the area of the CEJ and that they have bulky heights of contour interproximally. The margin of the preparation will be in this area, which means that the bulk of the height of contour will be cut away during preparation. Turn the Typodont on its side so you can have direct vision. Using an 8862 burr, also known as a break contact burr, an initial cut is made by passing the burr through the interproximal area in a buccal lingual direction, but leaving a small shelf of enamel to protect the adjacent tooth from iatrogenic damage. Once patency has been achieved, you can remove the shell of enamel. Use your 6856 burr to check that adequate contact has been broken. If there is inadequate room for this burr, open the contact more with the 8862 burr. Once patency is adequate, connect the margins with the buccal and the lingual. Again, be conscious of your burr orientation in regards to the long axis of the tooth. Now that the majority of the axial reduction has been completed, you may move on to the occlusal reduction. While ceramic preparations will have a roughly planar form, the cusp tips will ultimately be rounded and smooth. Reduction is done by orienting the burr to match the slope of the unprepped tooth. Starting from the depth groove at the ridge, make cuts down either side of the cusp. A depth cut in the buccal and lingual grooves is also an option to help with this reduction. Connect the cuts into the central grooves. Refer back to the adjacent teeth to maintain appropriate inclination of the burr. Once the axial reduction is close to completion, the functional cusp bevel and section plane reductions will be added. The functional cusp bevel is the slope featured on the upper 1/3 of the functional cusp. It must be incorporated into a preparation to allow adequate material thickness on this area of the crown, which will sustain most of the restoration's functional forces. The total functional cusp bevel reduction should be 2 millimeters. The adjacent tooth to help orient the correct angle, sweep across the upper 1/3 of the lingual axial wall extending from mesial to distal. It should look something like this. Notice when the reduction guide is seated that axial reduction is now uniform across the lingual. A similar process is executed on the buccal non-functional cusp. It too has a slope in the upper 1/3. This reduction is known as the second plane reduction and should be a total of 1.5 millimeters for the ceramic crown preparation. In a manner similar to the functional cusp bevel, the second plane reduction is made by orienting the burr to mirror the slope of the neighbor tooth and extending the reduction across the upper 1/3 of the buccal wall from mesial to distal. The finished reduction should look something like this. Once the majority of the reduction has been done, blunt the cusp tips such that they have a dull, rounded dome shape. This is an essential step for the ceramic preparation. Keep this in mind as you carry out your occlusal reduction. Knowing that you will be adding functional cusp bevels, second plane reductions, and returning to softened cusp tips, it can be helpful to leave them slightly tall during the planar reduction. Otherwise, you may be at risk for over-reduction. Your final reduction should look like this. Notice when the reduction guide is seated that there is a uniform reduction in comparison to the silhouette of the unprepped tooth. A uniform 1.5 millimeter reduction up the axial walls of the preparation, and a uniform 2 millimeter reduction across the occlusal surface and functional cusp bevel.